So hello everyone. It's really an honor to be here today. Especially, I'm a huge fan of Commissioner Peirce, she knows that. And it's funny that you're going to have a unicorn lady having a discussion with Crypto Mom. So what I wanted to start with is that nickname, Crypto Mom. Can you tell us a little bit about how did you get it?
Well, before I start with my nickname, I better give you my disclaimer, which is that the views that I represent are my own views and not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners at the Securities and Exchange Commission. So the Crypto Mom nickname came about after I dissented on, some of you probably are familiar with this, the Winklevoss twins were working with one of the exchanges to try to get an exchange-traded product listed that had a Bitcoin underlier. And that effort met with a no from my colleagues at the SEC. And I dissented from that decision because I felt that it was based on grounds that really exceeded our statutory authority, that we should not have gone and looked. I felt it was essentially merit regulation. And so after I issued my dissent, I got the moniker Crypto Mom, which I've welcomed, though I always say I'm not an advocate for any particular technology. I'm just a believer that the SEC has its lane, which is a regulatory lane, and its lane is not intended to be the same lane as the market. The market gets to decide whether products are good or bad. We just have to set a regulatory framework within which competition can happen.
Thank you. As you know, a lot of the audience here, we've got entrepreneurs and innovators, especially here in the Midwest. Can you tell us a little bit about the SEC? How does it work, the decision-making process? Can you just shed some light? What do you guys do?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because a lot of people have this notion that the SEC is a government bureaucracy, but it's hard to know what happens inside the black box. And a key important piece about the SEC is that it's a commission, so that means there are 5 of us commissioners, one of whom is the chairman, that's not me. And we make the decisions by consensus. And so that means that it's politically balanced, so that means that policy doesn't wildly change from administration to administration. You have a little more consistency of policy. A lot of the work that's done is done by our staff, which is spread throughout the country. And there's some decisions that they can actually make. We give them delegated authority to make certain decisions. So the staff is making certain decisions, and that is relevant in the crypto space, where some decisions are made initially by the staff. They're under delegated authority, and then they can be reviewed by the commission. But generally, all of the decisions about rulemaking or about enforcement actions are made by the 5 of us. And so we cover a lot of ground. We regulate the stock exchanges. We regulate companies that are trying to raise money across the United States. We regulate broker-dealers and investment advisors. So we have a pretty broad range. Where a lot of the intersection has come in this space has been in the area of initial coin offerings, and that sort of area. But I think there'll be more and more interactions as the financial industry finds uses for blockchain generally. And so we'll see, we're going to have to, as a regulator, learn more about that technology, learn more about what firms are doing with that technology. And so I think it's really an exciting time for us, and I appreciate the opportunity to interact with all of you today.
Thank you. So with regards to collaboration and interaction, can you tell us a little bit, how can people here in the room, how can they contact you? I know you have FinHub, and I'm sure it's very intimidating, right, to call up a regulator. Can you even do that? Can you even call up a regulator? Or when do they need to start, maybe
well,
thinking?
You can certainly call me up anytime you want. I'm a regulator, and people, as you suggest, don't really love calling regulators, so I can give my number out, 202-551-5080, and people don't actually call it, so, but you're welcome to if you want to. So you can talk to me directly, but you can also talk to our staff. And you mentioned the FinHub, which is a great resource for those of you who are working in this area, in the area of financial technology. The SEC, finally, it did take us quite a long time, set up a website and there's an email address that you can find on that website. You can email your request in through there to talk to someone on the FinHub staff. That's a dedicated group of people at the SEC who spend most of their time on these types of issues. And you can meet with them in person, you can talk to them on the phone. We do, our staff does peer-to-peer meetups across the country. I don't think they've been to Cleveland yet, but that might be a possibility at some point. And so you can talk to them about the projects you're working on, the ideas you have and concerns you have about where there might be an intersection with the securities laws and you have a concern about how to proceed. They're not going to give you legal advice, but they can give you some good tips. And my advice is do go talk to them. I know it can be intimidating, but I think it is useful to get that feedback as soon as you can in the process. And certainly keep me apprised if you have concerns about the interactions that you've had, or if you're either positive or negative comments and want to pass them on to me. I'm always open to that.
That's great. My next question has to do with financial regulation. And a lot of the innovation and technology, even if we think about Schumpeter, right? Disruptive creation, right? Has to do with laws that, do you think they're arcane, or do you think that they can handle all this new technology that a lot of these companies are developing? And more than that, not just the laws, I think it's more than that. I think it's also, I know there's a lot of risk with regards to capital formation on one, and taking into account innovation and technology, and on the other hand, really protecting the investors, right? There's a lot of concern with regards to fraud, anti-money laundering, our markets, how stable they're going to be as a result of all these new innovations. So if you can tell us a little bit about your feelings on this, your take on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, as a regulator, it's always difficult to get the balance right. On the one hand, you want to have a principles-based approach, which is sort of able to grow with changes in the economy, changes in technology that's available, changes in the marketplace, changes in investor and consumer demands. So that can be really positive if you keep a pretty open framework where you set basic parameters and people can do what they want within those parameters. But there is always a big demand for rules, right? For specific rules about, tell me exactly what I need to do and I'll do it. And when you start doing that kind of thing, then you end up baking technology into those rules. So then as technology changes, your rules are very outdated, and it's really hard to keep that fresh, because adopting rules is a really painstaking process at the SEC. We put them out we develop a proposal, we put it out for comment, we get the comment back, we revise it, then we put it out. And that can be a years-long process. And so trying to redo that as each wave of new technology comes is really not possible. That said, the securities laws, we as securities lawyers have always thought, oh, well, our securities laws are extremely flexible. They're designed to accommodate new changes. And the securities laws are designed to say, hey, if you're raising money from people to build a company, then you got to do it. Either you have to register that offering with us, or you've got to operate under some kind of an exemption. And it's worked for many years for many different kinds of offerings. The idea is you don't want people to just call it something other than selling stock, and therefore do an end run around the securities laws. And so that seems to make sense. It seems like it's worked pretty well over time. But I think in this space, there is a potential clash between the reality of what people are trying to do in this space, build these ecosystems in which you might use a token as the coin of the realm within that ecosystem. I think there's a potential clash between that and the securities laws as we've been interpreting them. So I'm not 100% sure that we can just sit back and say, hey, we don't need to do anything. thinking that we may actually need to make a tweak that is designed to allow some of these projects to really go forward and blossom.
Thank you. And I guess the other point is that there's also a lot of concern with regards to international competition, right? The fact that a lot of the companies, because of the uncertainty in the United States with regards to how are those companies going to be perceived and the offerings. So a lot are either incorporating outside the United States, or even some don't want to deal with any US customers. What do you think we could do to prevent that from happening? Or should we be concerned about that? Is that something that we should be concerned about?
I think we should be concerned. The US has always been the place where people want to come to do innovation, and that's wonderful. We get people from all over the world wanting to come here and wanting to put their brains to work here, which is great. We want to keep that up. And so again, it's not that I don't want to see development in other places in the world. I think it's great when other places develop as well. But what I don't like to hear, and what I too often hear, is, Hester, we really would love to do this in the US, but we're not doing it in the US because of lack of clarity on the regulatory side. And not only are they not doing the project in the US, but as you said, they're not even willing to deal with US persons in any capacity. So investors, customers in the US are being shut out, and that certainly isn't good. So we're going to see development and real improvements to people's lives happening from these new technologies, and we in the US aren't going to be able to take advantage of those. So I think it is something that we have to pay attention to. We can't just say, well, we've always been the best place to be, so we're going to assume that we always will be the best place to be. You've got to keep fighting for that number one spot.
And being here in the Midwest, I also wanted to ask you about, what do you think? Do you think that we're going to allow more retail investors to invest, just in general? Are we going to change some of our securities laws to allow people in the Midwest that might not meet some of the requirements for investment, in the private markets to invest?
Well, so we've seen a trend of the private markets in the U.S. growing and the public markets not being as attractive. There haven't been as many initial public offerings in the U.S. So a lot of the action is in the private markets. And I, as a Midwesterner, often complain that these rules that we have that say you've got to have a certain amount of income or a certain amount of wealth before you can invest in the private markets as a general matter. I've said, well, it's kind of geographically discriminatory, because I know that people I know back in Ohio are not making the kind of salaries that they're making on the coast. In fact, they don't need to, because the cost of living is much lower in the Midwest. And so it's sort of a skewed measure of sophistication. People in the Midwest who are extremely sophisticated are not making those high salaries, and so they don't get to invest in these things. And so I think I'm not the only one who's made that observation. Lots of people have made that observation, and there is a lot of pressure to change the accredited investor standard. One of the most common comments that I get from people is their frustration about the accredited investor standard, especially from young people who are often very sophisticated about technology and want to be able to participate in some of these things and can't do so. So I think given that people have been talking about changing the standard or expanding the standard for some time, I think we could see some changes. They likely wouldn't be as broad as I would want, but you never know, I guess. I'll keep making the argument that there's something un-American about telling people you're not rich enough to get rich. So I'm hoping we can work on that.
And speaking of innovation, I want to ask you about your safe harbor ideas, and then open it up to some suggestions or questions from the audience. But I want to hear from you. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the ideas that you've had with regards that are going to hopefully help all of you here in the room in the future?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think that the securities law framework and the Howey test, which I'm sure all of you have heard about, has been relatively successful in governing a lot of our decisions about what is a securities offering and what is not. Even there, I think there's been some creep in terms of the expansion of what it is to be a security. But in this space, what I worry about is that if you have a token network that's getting ready to launch and really needs to get those tokens into the hands of people who will use them, you are unable to do that for fear that your token could be classified as a security. And that doesn't really make sense if your token is really for a particular purpose. But I think that if we could craft a safe harbor that said, look, you've got a couple years, 2 or 3 years within which you can develop your token network, and if you tell us that you're taking advantage of this safe harbor, we'll give you that time to do that. And so then you have much more of a case to come to us and say, hey, this has nothing to do with the securities offering. This is actually us just trying to get our network up and running. And so that's what we're hoping that we can do. I'm working on sort of figuring out how to design that. Would welcome input from those of you who maybe have projects that are at the stage of really wanting to get them out into the hands of the public. Would love to hear from you to talk to you about how we might craft that in a way that could work. And obviously what we're trying to do is we're trying to achieve there need to be some conditions on it to make sure that folks who buy the tokens have full information about what they're buying and about the plans of the token network developers. But at this in investor protections in general that would mirror investor protections, but at the same time the freedom to get the token out into use by the wider public.
That's great. So I wanted to open this up to the audience, and we have a person here with a mic. So if you're interested in asking a question, please stand up and we'll have the person with the mic come up to you and give you the mic.
And if you guys don't ask questions, I'm going to have to start asking you questions.
Oh.
So do you see the person with the mic?
I don't see the person with the mic, but...
it's really hard to see anything up here,
yes.
Actually. Okay, shout it out and we can translate it.
Here she is. Thank you.
You can shout it out.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Yes.
Commissioner, and I want to thank you again for making the trip here. And as a former SEC enforcement and corporation finance lawyer, I just truly applaud your efforts to move forward with exactly what you're describing. As we've discussed, I'll state an observation, and then because I know you embrace it, in terms of viewing the SEC relative to other global regulators, and the SEC just enjoying a global reputation for many years to be that premier securities regulator. In terms of practicality moving forward, folks in the audience, the ability to reach out to you and of course and be able to come through the FinTech hub and that, do you sense just in terms of not a sea change, but a shift at both, I'll say, an industry acceptance of regulatory expectations in this area? And I guess, can we truly look at, and again, with your hard work and initiatives underway like this safe harbor, in terms of time frame, can you give us a little bit of a roadmap as to what that looks like for the next literally year or two and more of the short term, if that makes any sense?
It does. In terms of a sea change in the industry, I would say that I've been getting a very consistent message for the entire time I've been a commissioner, which is now about 2 years, and that is just please provide us clarity. We are happy to comply with regulations, but we need to know what they are. And so that frustration definitely comes through. I do think that there will be a change in the attitude of the SEC. I think it's a slow process, but I think there's a realization that technology is moving along, and if we don't get with the program, it's going to move along without us, and that's not a good thing. And there's a lot of work that's going on in this space, in the blockchain space particularly, that's by the financial institutions that we all deal with all of the time. And I think they're looking at how they can use blockchain technology for their purposes. Some of those projects, in terms of research and development projects, thinking about how they might use blockchain, they're long-term projects. They're not going to have an overnight aha moment where they decide exactly what they are going to do with the technology. But the fact that that the institutions that we're more used to dealing with are also looking at this technology, I think will help to further the push for regulatory clarity in the area. And so from that perspective, I'm optimistic. In terms of time frame, I realize that I talk about these things and talk about the need for speed, and it can be very slow. And even on my part, I've been talking about the safe harbor for a little while, and I am trying to get that developed and fleshed out a little bit more so that people have something concrete to react to. And I hope to do that relatively soon, and then I hope that I can convince my colleagues that they should consider something like this. Again, my goal is to meet their objectives and satisfy their concerns. My colleagues and the staff at the SEC are approaching this whole space with a real concern for some of the problems that have been front and center in the space. And they're problems that all of you are familiar with as well. And so trying to make sure that we can say to them, look, we realize their problems, we can address those problems, but at the same time, we can put out something concrete that allows people to latch on to a framework and move forward. So far, we've been quite active in the enforcement space, which probably a lot of you know, but there also have been a couple of attempts by the staff to do no action relief in this area, and that's an informal staff way of saying, if you do if you follow through on the plan as you've described it to us, we won't recommend to the SEC, to the Commission, that they bring an enforcement action against you. And so that, I think, those examples had the potential to be positive, but I fear that the way that they were crafted was so narrow as to be almost damaging, and I've said this in other contexts. And so what I'm hoping to do with the safe harbor is to present a more workable, generic framework that people could use. And so that's why I really do need input from folks on what something like that would look like from your perspective. Again, bearing in mind our need to make sure that our markets are protected and that folks who buy these tokens are protected.
That's great. So so we want to hear from you. What are some suggestions, concerns? I see a few more hands here.
I think there's one right over here.
Yep.
So what's your opinion on the regulatory sandboxes? Are they stifling innovation, or are they an opportunity, an on-ramp, or is there a hybrid that's better?
Well, I think regulatory sandboxes, first of all, they sound really nice, right? This idea that you can come in and you can tell your regulator, hey, this is what we're trying to do. We understand that we may not be fully compliant with all of the rules in doing this, so we're going to tell you what it is we're doing, we're going to pre-clear it with you, and we're going to make sure that no consumers and investors get hurt. And some jurisdictions, I think, have been quite successful with this. The UK has been very much out front with a sandbox approach, and there have been other jurisdictions that have been trying these sandbox approaches as well, and I think it for one, sends a really positive message. It says, hey, we realize that innovators are trying to do things, and we hope that there are better ways that these innovators can come up with better ways to serve consumers, investors, et cetera, in the market. And so that's positive, just sending the message, and the idea that you can actually try something and that you've got an opportunity to try it without waiting for years to get that trial going. In the past, I've been a little critical of the sandbox idea, and my reason for being skeptical of it is that I think regulation can stifle the creative juices in people. And so a lot of the really creative thinking happens in very organic ways, and it's a little less possible to have that organic development happen if at every step of the way you're turning to your regulator and saying, hey, by the way, here's what I'm planning to do, what do you think? It then becomes more about the regulation than it is about the innovation. So while I'm positive and I think maybe there's room for some kind of sandboxing at the SEC, I will always approach it with a little bit of skepticism. One point that I think I should have mentioned earlier is that in the US, we're unusual for the number of financial regulators that we have. There are a whole plethora of them at the federal level, and then we, of course, have the state regulators. And everyone always wants to get a piece of the action, right? So trying to figure out how can we get all the regulators on the same page, working together, talking together, thinking about where jurisdiction should properly lie. Should it be at the SEC? Should it be at the CFTC? Those are really important things for us to be doing. And I think a cross-agency sandbox, which would be out of my authority to get up and running, but I think that kind of an idea could be really powerful, especially in the fintech space, because then you could go to one place and you could kind of see who it is you need to get your approvals from, and there'd be coordination so that you wouldn't have to bounce from one regulator to the next. So even within the SEC, we sometimes have regulatory silos where one division of the SEC will look at something and have certain comments, then another division is looking with another set of comments, and by that time, you're many months down the road and you don't have anything to show for it yet. So that kind of coordination is important. And then, of course, in this space, international coordination is important. There is a lot of international work in terms of thinking about some of the things that all of us are seeing. So I'm involved in some of that international work, but there is a lot of that happening. So I think we need to keep talking to each other. That doesn't mean that I think we all need to have, that every country needs to have an identical regulatory framework. I think that brings its own problems, but it is important for us to talk to each other.
Definitely.
So you mentioned the Midwest and having to be wealthy to get more wealthy, and I like that comment. I know recently some new regulation was passed to loosen some of the rules with 401k investing. I was a little surprised that it went towards annuities, which typically, if you're in the financial space, those are not what most people should be in. They're a limited audience, and it just felt like maybe the insurance industry really pushed hard for that. I think from an entrepreneurial point of view, if you offer the ability to invest 401k dollars in private equity for those, currently today unaccredited investors, it could be a very interesting pool of capital. There's a lot of people that are 30, 35, they may have $50 or $80 or $100,000 in a 401k, and they work for a startup and they don't know where to come up with the 10 or 20,000 to put into their own startup. It could be a very interesting opportunity. And the other thing I want you to think about is pension funds are going away. We currently are managing our own pension dollars and our own 401ks. So the pension dollars that are going away from investing in the private equity industry need to come from individuals, not from the pensions that were managed by the GEs and the GMs of the world.
So a couple interesting observations that you make there. I think, first of all, your question is a perfect follow-on to my comment about the diversity of regulators in the U.S. We are not the regulator of retirement plans. That's the Department of Labor. But the point about pensions, institutional pensions going away and being replaced by defined contribution plans where you're then often managing your own money does raise some interesting questions. Can we think about ways to open up the opportunity for investors to take their retirement and diversify it a little bit more? And I emphasize the diversify because I think it's important for people to think about their portfolio as a whole, and we are sometimes guilty as a regulator of thinking on an investment by investment basis and saying, that's a very risky investment. But in reality, you have to think about it in the scope of the investor's portfolio. And I would even say a little bit more broadly, the particular retail investor ought to be thinking not only about how diversified her portfolio is, but how diversified her economic exposure. I'm not giving investment advice, by the way. but her economic exposure as a whole. So if you are working for a company, you need to be cognizant of the fact that if you're invested heavily in that company, that means if something happens to the company, both your investments and your career have taken a hit. So you have to be careful in that area. But I think we are, as a commission, thinking about the fact that there is a lot of activity now in the private markets and wanting to make sure that people have access to the growth that's happening in those markets. How can we think about that? What's the best way to think about it while keeping investor protection in mind? Some people have specifically said, we really think you should carve out retirement funds and say those can't be involved in this investment. If you have extra money, that's one thing. So we're getting a lot of different points of view on this, and it's been interesting to hear. And of course, one bad story can really, and there are bad stories, right? We want everyone to go into investing with a healthy skepticism, asking lots of questions, thinking carefully before you commit your money. But I'm of the view that if you work really hard to make your money, you ought to be able to think about what you want to do with it without having to worry about us, your regulators, saying, no, we know better than you do how you should invest your hard-earned money.
That's great.
Commissioner, excuse me, to the extent that you think the Howey test is not appropriate for blockchain tokens, could you say a word or two more about why that's the case?
Well, so I'm glad you asked the question because I think I need to be clear. If you are setting up essentially a company and you're raising money and you're doing it by selling something that you call a token instead of a share of your company, but it's actually just a share of your company, or it somehow is like a debt security or like an equity security, then I think the Howey test is the proper way to look at it, to assess that, and it would fall within an investment contract, which is one type of security that the Howey test is designed to assess. But I think it's important to remember that it's the investment contract is the security. The token, if that token is what you're intending to have be used to operate in the network that you're building, I don't think it's really right to look at the token as the security itself. And so I think what a lot of people are running into now is if you've raised money for your project using venture capital, and now your project is ready to get off the ground and actually have people use it, so you're going to use a token for that project, and you want to sell those tokens. So, if you want to participate in the network, you've got to buy a token. At that point, I don't think that what you're selling is a security. Again, depending on the facts and circumstances always matter in securities law. But I think we've painted with such a broad brush that now it looks like anything that is in any way related to a token is a security, and I don't think from a securities law perspective that is accurate. So I think we have to talk a little bit more precisely. If you're raising money for a company, sure, that's a security. But if you're just selling something to be used in a functioning network, doesn't look like a security to me.
Let me reiterate the thanks for coming and for the leadership that you've provided in this industry. We have a new paradigm here, basically, and it's a mental model, and they put boundaries around what we think constrain our actions, and they're often based on assumptions that are so strong that we don't know that they're there. And if you're raising money for something, it must be a security, and it should be treated by securities law. And if you think about the fact that this is the early days of an internet of value, that's the way we like to think of it, there are thousands of types of assets, not just securities, which of course are very important, that'll be tokenized. And it seems like such a big challenge, and I'm just wondering to get people to understand that. And I'm wondering, so I'll get to the question. as a leader, you know, how do you think of yourself as someone who's right in the cutting edge of bringing about a very profound change in the nature of the corporation, the nature of capital markets and the way our economy works, and so on, where you have an entire paradigm of leaders of the old that are sort of have these old views and attitudes, not just attitudes, but structures. You know, you're going to raise money for something. The securities people are likely to say it's a security, and the revenue people are likely to say you're selling something, they want to tax you on it, and you're probably in an industry that has a whole set of regulation on that. And it seems just like such an overwhelming thing sometimes. And I'm just kind of curious on your view. What gets you up in the morning? And what's your hope for us making some real progress on this over the next period?
I think it's not an overwhelming task if you view it the way that I think about a lot of things, which is I don't think that knowledge is centered in any one person or group of people. I think it's dispersed throughout the population. And what we need to do in this context, as we're thinking about what the right regulatory framework should be, and as we're thinking about how our existing regulatory framework interacts with technology, we need to be drawing on the wisdom of people out there who are technologists. We need to be drawing on the wisdom of Anat, who's a business, who's thinking about business structures, and she's thinking about how this new decentralized world will fit within the textbooks that she's teaching from now. So we have the wisdom of academics, we've got the wisdom of technologists who are doing this, we've got the wisdom of practicing lawyers. I think the biggest fault that regulators, the biggest problem and trap that regulators run into is they think, hey, I'm the one, I've got the answer. Everyone else just has to wait to hear from on high. That is how we've gotten in so many problems. And that's why I have concerns about some of the regulations that came out of the crisis, because I think they are premised on the idea that all of the knowledge is housed in the minds of a few regulators sitting in Washington, D.C., and I can tell you, being from the Midwest, there's a lot of intellectual activity that's going on outside DC, and if we shut ourselves off from that, we're setting ourselves up for failure. So, you know, one of the things that really attracts me to the blockchain space is the idea that it enables people, and again, you know, there are different kinds of blockchains, and so permission blockchains are one thing, and I think will be very valuable. Permissionless blockchains allow us to bring together people from all over the world to join together, to bring their talents together and work on things together, and that's very exciting. It's exciting not only because we're able to pull from talent that before has not been able to be drawn upon. We're able to pull from the talent of women who are sitting in villages in India who have otherwise no ability to access the broader economy. Those are really exciting things because there's some brilliant minds out there that otherwise we wouldn't be able to tap. And so let's take advantage of that kind of thinking as we think about the regulatory framework. I think it's always really powerful to bring together the diversity of talent that is, you know, we've got this country that has so many people with so many different talents, and then we can draw even beyond the country internationally. So that's what gets me up in the morning. That's what gets me excited.
Well, thank you so much. So on that note, I wanted to thank you again, and it's exciting to be here in Cleveland. You know, it's ranked in the top 10 of innovating cities in the United States, and to be part of this ecosystem of innovation here, I think it's amazing because we're drawing in the public, private, academics, the government, of course, so I think it's amazing. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for
the
conversation.
Thank you.